My guest today is Dr. Marisa Porges, who is known for her work on leadership, education, and national security. Dr. Porges combines lessons she's learned throughout her career in a recent book, What Girls Need: How to Raise Bold, Courageous, and Resilient Women. Dr. Porges served in the Obama White House and was a visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and the Council on Foreign Relations, where her research focused on worldwide counterterrorism efforts. And she served in the U.S. Navy as one of 8 female aviators in an air wing of about 200. She now leads the Baldwin School, a 130-year-old all-girls school outside of Philadelphia, renowned for academic excellence and preparing girls to be leaders and changemakers. Well, thanks so much for joining us on Candid Leadership, Dr. Porges. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me, Candace. Great to be here.
It is so wonderful to talk about your book, What Girls Need: How to Raise Bold, Courageous, and Resilient Women. And what a time to send this forward into the ethos, because I think we are all, as parents right now, and as people, in national security, looking for something that really can provide insight for those key nuggets that will push us into the future. And one thing you really talk about in your book is nurturing a competitive spirit to help girls thrive. And I think the competitive spirit is important now more than ever. And can you kind of discuss why that is so good for our kids?
Yeah, well, I think there's 2 things that come to mind here. One is the basic premise that being competitive makes you perform better personally, right? It's not about beating the other person or, winning at all costs, but it's about being your personal best. And studies have shown for years, right, dating back to the late 1800s, when one of the first natural studies, and that was conducted with both kids and adults, showed that you perform better. And the first study was when riding a bike, when you're riding next to somebody else and trying to, beat them to the finish line. And it's something that I think we've forgotten about, in modern times, where we want to teach our kids to avoid being bad sports or sort of, get into that, the maladaptive form of competitive we've seen a lot lately. And so I think a lot of parents shy away from nurturing the competitive spirit in their kids. And then it's in particular, as a woman who saw how much being a solid, good competitor or having a healthy competitive spirit served me well, I think it's something that does a detriment to our girls, particularly when you see that being competitive, which means being resilient, pushing yourself to your personal best, being okay with winning and losing and throwing your hat into the ring, is something that many girls don't have, but serves them well no matter where they head next. And this is, again, speaks to my own personal story. When I was serving in the military, I can remember those moments when I wasn't sure I could do it, when I had that imposter syndrome set in, or when I just was up against something tough. Being able to dig into a competitive spirit that had been nurtured early on as an athlete in school and other moments at home really made the biggest difference for me.
And thank you so much for that. In your book, you talk about in business, and I'm going to quote you, over 90% of the executives leading Fortune 500 companies, those C-suite professionals who we really hold as exemplars of success in the corporate world, were competitive athletes when they were young. And I think that's really important when we look at women, because of the women in those positions, 74% of female executives said that their background in sports could help accelerate a woman's career. How do you see competitive sports really playing into that as well?
Yeah, well, and this is, you look at so many, whether it's C-suite executives or the women that we hold up in government and national security, everyone from Condoleezza Rice to other female leaders in government and in the private sector who were competitive athletes in both high school and college. But then you think about the studies that show during adolescence, by and large, girls start dropping out of sports at a much higher rate than boys. By age 14, girls drop out of competitive sports 2 times more often than boys because of peer pressure or social norms or this idea that it's not the feminine girly thing to do. And then you see this gap emerge where the things that we learn about being our personal best and again, throwing your hat in the ring, whether it's in the environment of athletics or say politics, is a critical muscle memory to build that, serves you wherever you head next. So I do think it's something that we as women need to nurture and then live lean into when we're adults. One thing that I learned when I was in the White House was how much it actually helps around a conference table, right? This idea that we can dig into the competitive, want to win, not, do our best even in those environments, because it helps, at least me personally, remember to speak up, remember to put my ideas forward, remember that that's a little bit of a game too in some ways. And we want to be our best in that environment as well.
You're absolutely right. And I think there are those critical tipping points. You spoke about women in middle school, that age 14. We see that in careers of women that get into the workforce. And really, it's not necessarily that first job, that internship, but as they begin to go forward, and I say years 6 through 11 of their career, there's that another tipping point too, where having competitive skills, having adaptability, and also the ability to solve problems, that collaborative problem solving skills, that's another area you really dug into. And I'd love to talk to you about how you look at cultivating collaborative problem solving skills.
Well, and so this is one where we think, wow, such a 21st century idea, right? This idea of you need to solve problems in teams and build consensus across different areas, and something particularly important in the military, national security, this idea of it's just not one person who can solve any problem. You need to be able to coordinate. And it's actually, per social science research, something that comes naturally to women, right? A lot of it has to do with social norms we're raised with early on about how we communicate, how we relate to others and groups, how we try to solve middle grounds and do so with empathy and understanding. And it's something we as women should be leaning into as we develop into leaders in lots of different places. And it is something we can cultivate, I think, in part by talking about how important it is, and then finding moments where we lean into problem solving groups. We think about it as a skill unto itself, and then reinforce the importance of it. It's something I do with my team here at, I run a school now, as you mentioned to start. I'm, transitioned out of national security and now running an all-girls school. But I continually, find moments with my team and with our students where we put them in moments with each other in groups and then talk about how they're working together. It's not so much the outcome that matters, but it's the idea that they work together. And I think finding those moments with our teams, with our mentees, with whatever group you're part of, is incredibly powerful as a way to reinforce this skill as something we can develop and nurture over time.
And Dr. Porges, you mentioned one key word, and you use it throughout your book. And again, this book is so great because it talks to those of us. I am one of those that has a daughter just right in the sweet spot of where this book is targeted towards. But I want to encourage parents, whether you have, boys or girls, this book is fantastic because it gives you the opportunity to look at things from different angles. And one area where, Marisa, you dig into is why empathy is so critical as a leader. When you're talking about girls that perform better sometimes than boys in the country, regardless of economic status, after normalizing for prior schooling in science, reading, and math, on average, they scored nearly 30 points higher and were 1.6 times more likely to be rated top performers at this essential 21st century skill. Marisa, the skill that you really talk about that is so critical as a leader is empathy. And you hit that over and over. You even quote some Army doctrine in your book, so thumbs up to that. But I appreciated that when you're talking through our former, national security advisor, those people who are really critical in talking about a skill most people wouldn't associate with the military, and that's empathy. Can you dive into that?
Yeah, I think this is one that I love talking about it because I think it challenges us to think of what we always consider a soft skill, but in a way that's both soft and hard and so powerful, right? This idea that empathy is a core leadership skill that, yes, it makes you a more compassionate leader. It makes you a better communicator when you can understand other people's perspectives and take them into account. But it also makes you better at what you do, better at driving bottom line if you're in a situation where you're looking at profit margins, but also better at, pursuing national security objectives and sort of your military goals, right? The quote you mentioned in the book is from General H.R. McMaster, who is known for his military service in Iraq, as well as many other things. And when you talk to him about one of the key skills and key ways that they pursued their objectives in Iraq, it was by understanding the perspective of those they were serving, with, alongside Iraqis and others, and against, right? And he says, no, empathy was what made us effective. It was so powerful that, in fact, to your point, they now have it in the Army Field Manual for Leadership. One of the core skills to train for is to be an empathetic leader. It makes you better mentor. It makes you better at, navigating conflicts within your team and making sure that your teams perform to their utmost. It's also something that studies show comes more naturally to women. And this starts young, from elementary school. They've done studies that show that by age 4, 5, 6, girls and boys have different empathetic tendencies. There was one study for those parents who may remember the movie Rodney, about a Disney movie about robots, a cartoon. They actually interviewed girls and boys after watching segments of the movie and asked them questions about the robotic characters in the Disney movie. And girls were more likely to be empathetic, to understand the perspective of those in the movie and then take it into account when they were sort of describing what was happening and what other people were thinking about in the movie. And that is a nugget that can be nurtured over time, so that not just when they're in high school and college, but when you're in the workforce, when you're leading teams in combat zones or wherever you may head next, you are a better, more effective leader. It's been shown across the board to make you better at what you do. In fact, it's something that now companies as varied as Ford Motor Company to Warby Parker actually teach and train their new hires to be better at. So I do think it's something that if we talk about more and more, not as a soft skill, but as a core critical leadership skill, I think it's both impactful for us all and sets our girls to, an advantage in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And when we look at providing them an advantage, some of what you've also written about is really the technological innovations that occur and those 21st century skills that are needed for girls to succeed in this rapidly changing landscape. The decade ahead will really demand new things. And you've talked about how, especially for our children who enter the workforce, that world is going to be different in so many fundamental ways. What are some of those most critical 21st century skills that you see we need to nurture?
Well, I think we've talked about two of them already, right? This idea of problem solving in teams and collaborating, and this idea of being an empathetic leader, right? I think those are two amazingly powerful skills that boys and girls should be taught, but girls are at an advantage for. So we as parents and educators should lean into, and as leaders should be nurturing in our teams. The other one that, really comes to mind is the ability to adapt, to be a flexible thinker, to be cognitively resilient in a lot of ways. That's sort of what it speaks to. It's because the pace of technology means that things are changing more and more, not just each year, but every month and every day. But it also speaks to how the world is changing beyond that, right? And just look at the past year. The fact that we've had to adapt everything we do, remote work, remote school, thinking differently about, the daily act of both professional and personal life. Those who've been able to, I don't know if we say thrive in the midst of a pandemic, but at least be resilient and keep moving in a positive direction are those who are adaptable. And so I think that is the third, key skill I would say that we need to think about in our teams as leaders and for our kids as parents. And again, it is something that can be taught and nurtured over time in small and big ways.
And that was probably, of all the chapters in your great book, I thought that last chapter on adaptability and how that will be key was so important. You spoke a bit about an adaptability quotient. We really talk about emotional intelligence and EI, that coming into our moniker about a decade ago. But adaptability, the AQ, I think that's something I want to take forward. And I think our listeners would really pay you well to kind of look at this, because in the World Economic Forum, those top 10 skills for 2020, so much of those had adaptability woven into them. Really, they talked about emotional intelligence, the EI, but that last skill that was just added this year is cognitive flexibility. You spoke to that. And how can you see us kind of start to harvest that, both in our girls and also in those new people coming into the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, and so it's such an interesting concept that has just started taking hold, this idea of your adaptability quotient, literally like how effective you are at dealing with change, being resilient when new things come along. And one way that studies have shown you can nurture this in each other and your people is actually something that I think everyone listening, particularly, if you've been in the military, served in national security, you know about after action reports and sort of those moments when you look at lessons learned that focus on failures, that focus on things that went wrong, have actually been shown to make you more resilient and more flexible the next time you faced any sort of challenge or moment of crisis. So it's an interesting concept. We always think about needing to focus on positive outcomes and things that we do well and want to then repeat. But it's actually those sticking points, the little F failures in life that for ourselves and our teams and our kids have the most impact on our ability to be cognitively flexible. And so I think it's a good thing to remember, whether you're at home with your kid and you're talking about a little moment in the day. I mean, one trick that we talk about with our parents and our families is the idea of sharing highs and lows, or some people call them roses and thorns, on a regular basis, just making it part of your day. And, one family I interviewed, one girl I interviewed for the book, said it's something that they do, when she gets into the car on the drive home, that her mom says, "Hey, what was the rose and thorn of the day?" And it's usually something small. It's the fact that, she forgot her lunch, and that was the small F failure of the day. And, so she had to figure out what to do for lunch. And her high could have been something as easy as, shooting the free throw well on the basketball court. And then the mom models it by sharing her own highs and lows of the day. And we each have them, right? It's the moment that you reply all to by accident and send a mass email that you didn't mean to, or sort of there was typos in a report that went to your boss or whatever it is. And you share a high point too. And it feeds into the idea that we each have these highs and lows, but it's what you do next, right? It's how you respond to the challenge. It's how you adapt to something that's a challenge or different or new. And over time, when you develop the flexible thinking skills that mean you're good in those moments, that you bounce back quickly, it feeds itself. It makes you, as you get older, better when the bigger moments come. And those are the job changes, the career moments, the moments you don't get a job or you have to move or change schools, whatever it is at different points in life. And it builds the ability to be adaptable in the macro level when you can do it in micro ways each and every day.
And that goes to the adage, exactly, Marisa, that life is 10% of what happens to you and 90% of how you react to that small 10%. That's spot on. And understanding at a young age, failure is going to happen, but how you respond and react to it is so critical and key. Great advice for our listeners. Another area I thought was fascinating in your book is really finding your own voice, finding the space and the ability to not only come into an environment when you're ready and you're prepared and you're at the table, but then being able to speak up. And I think there were small ways that you talked about preparing our girls to do this young. And if you could go through some of those tips and tricks, I think the readers would really appreciate it.
Yeah, and this is such an important skill for us to reinforce with girls, young women, and I think with each other as female leaders, wherever you are, because statistically speaking, women do speak out and speak up less than men. We are interrupted more often, whether you're in a military environment, in the Silicon Valley tech sector, or at the Supreme Court, where studies of female Supreme Court justices show that they are interrupted vastly more often than male Supreme Court justices. Crazy to think. And yet there's small ways that we can start building the muscle memory it takes to feel comfortable, not just earning a seat at the table, but then speaking up when you're there. And it is, again, goes back to the idea of practice, practice, practice. From a young age, this is something that parents can do with your daughters in everyday moments. Not all the time. It's not about being perfect, but it's about finding the moment around the dinner table when you're talking about what movie to go to, or what next trip you want to take, or anything that's going on. And you may notice that your son or the men around the table are speaking more than the girls and your daughters. It's about making sure that she has given the space, that she is called out in the kind way that we do, say, hey, what do you think? What's your vote? What is your opinion on this matter? Whatever the debate of the day is. Then finding moments that take you outside the family sphere. the next time the family is ordering dinner at a restaurant or over the phone, it's a good reason not to use your smartphone to order, but actually to pick up the phone and call for takeout these days. Have your daughter place the order. It's something that I actually learned from, again, one of the students at my school who, when asked how she became such a powerful self-advocate as a teenager, as a high schooler, she actually pointed to moments when she was 10 years old and her dad used to make her, not her brother, call to order pizza. And she says, I hated it. I didn't like it. I didn't feel comfortable, but I had to do it every time. And she referenced that when I talked to her about a moment when she was 17 years old and she was sexually harassed in a public place on a neighboring campus near our school. And she knew what to do next. And it wasn't just get out of there and sort of protect herself and sort of run to the car that was waiting nearby with an adult in it. It was the fact that when she got out of the dire situation she was in, where she was being catcalled and screamed after and commented on her body and all those moments that we sort of cringe when we think that can happen to our girls, particularly so young. And then, she sat down and wrote an email to the president of the school where she was at that moment and said, "Dear sir, I want to report something that happened. I want to tell you what happened and then suggest what to do next." And sure enough, 36 hours later, she was in a room with the head of security, the president, and the director of HR talking about what had happened to make sure that it didn't happen again to somebody else. And these are moments that are few and far between, because even at college, forget high school, even at college, only 1 in 4 moments of sexual harassment are reported. And so when you take those small moments early on, and you think, well, how did that happen? And she says that, when I asked, this young teenager said, it happened because my dad early on made me call for pizza. Like, he taught me that I needed to practice using my voice, and I was comfortable even in the most stressful moments doing that. So I do think that we can find little moments. And again, as leaders, we can find little moments with our teams as well. When you see women around your table, find ways to make sure that they have their moment to talk out and practice and have the opportunities that will help them feel most comfortable, so that they can do so in the little moments within your team and the bigger moments at home or outside of the home too.
That is so key, especially when you're talking about girls that look around and role models. And that instant, she had remembered in the past, she had taken something from her past and applied it to something in the future. And of course, it's very meaningful in your book and where it's placed and how that is weaved with finding your voice. But the fact you also point to role models that matter at every age. And can you speak to the fact, I know I had heard you in previous speaking engagements about, if you can see it, you can be it. And that is something I'd love to hammer home, of why we need these representative, very strong women leaders in all aspects, whether it's technology, government, business, nonprofits. Each of these agencies, when we have powerful women in leadership positions, it makes a difference to those who are working, because they think, I can definitely get to that level. But it's also inspirational in the fact that to get to that level, I've got to work hard where I'm at.
Well, this speaks to so much of what I see each and every day running a school for all girls, right? Literally, we are building an environment where everywhere you look, the girls that the younger students are looking up to are young women just like them a few years later. And they see the role models in place, the captains of the team, the head of the newspaper, the head of the Senate, all the student Senate are all young women. But we think of it more macroly. We think about the fact that, the first female vice president just stepped into office. And it's something that no matter what side of the aisle you're on or what your politics may be, pointing that out to women at any stage of life or their career, from our young girls, our daughters, our granddaughters, the young women in our life, to young mentees or those that we're serving and working with. It's a sign of, any door can be opened. It may not have been opened in the past, but through hard work and determination and support from teams and your team along the way, you can get there. And it's actually something that, again, studies show makes a bigger difference for women than men, largely because for so many years, there haven't been as many female role models that women and girls have looked up to. And so that's part of it. And, but a lot of it has to do with how we relate to those around us and sort of how we, how that informs our sense of identity and sense of self. For me, I can remember that when I stepped into my training squadrons, towards the end of flight school, and I started flying jets, the person that from an identity standpoint made the biggest impact was the singular female pilot who was instructor at the time. The woman who had been a couple of steps ahead and showed me that it could be done, that dream that I'd been pursuing for so long that didn't have any women doing, but I knew I wanted to do it, at least at the time. So years ago now, there was an example of it being done by someone who, looked enough like me that I could picture myself in her shoes. And I can still remember every moment that I had in a room, the ready room briefing with someone who was a little bit ahead of me, but another female aviator, made a tremendous impact on my self-esteem and my ability to imagine myself heading that direction. So I think it's something that is important for us at all stages of our career, particularly for young girls.
Thanks so much, Dr. Porges. Is there anything else you'd love to tell our audience?
I think it's, helpful to remember that none of this is about being perfect as parents or as leaders or as mentors, but it's just about finding small moments to, think about what those in your sphere of influence, but particularly the women, the girls who you have around you, whether they're your daughters, your nieces, your loved ones, or the young women on your team, what can make a lasting difference through how they think about themselves, how they adapt, how they problem solve, how they empathize, right? Again, little things have a really big impact in the young women in your life. And so just finding small moments to reinforce these key 21st century skills goes a long way.
Marisa, thanks so much. That's great advice. And we've appreciated having you here on Candid Leadership.
Well, it's been great to be here. And for those who are listening, please check out the book, which is available on Amazon or any place you buy a book these days, your local independent bookstore too. And find me online. The whatgirlsneed.com is my website. And for those there's resources for parents and leaders on there, but feel free to reach out with other questions because I think this is a conversation that we need to have and dive into now more than ever.
That was Dr. Porges. If you want to learn more about her book, What Girls Need, How to Raise Bold, Courageous, and Resilient Women, you can check it out wherever you find books, at your local independent bookseller or online. I really appreciate you listening to this conversation. If you want more candid perspectives on leadership, go to colonelcandid.com, COLONELCANDID.com. There you'll find articles, podcasts, and resources for your leadership journey. I would also encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and whoever you think could benefit from the information and wisdom shared by my amazing guests. I know I grow with every conversation, and we want to share that experience with as many leaders as we can. This show grows by word of mouth, so be sure to share this podcast. And if you think we've earned it, leave us a 5-star review. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colonel Candace Frost.